The grand conspiracy against President Trump. What is the legal theory behind it? And can these cases stand up in the federal courts? New criminal charges against the former FBI Director James Comey. Is the former CIA Director John Brennan next? And will former President Barack Obama have to answer to allegations of a treasonous conspiracy to undermine the results of the 2016 presidential election? Is the grand conspiracy case about hobbling a sitting president of the United States?
Well, timing-wise, it certainly suggests that to me. You know, an outgoing president manufacturing intelligence information with the help of a CIA director, if that's all true, that seems directed towards fueling what became kind of frivolous impeachments from my perspective.
Now, you'll remember Tulsi Gabbard released some files mid to late last year that suggested that the intelligence briefings up until after the election that were going to Obama said that Russia was interfering somewhat, but they didn't necessarily interfere to help Donald Trump. They were just sort of trying to muck up the system. And then Obama basically said, hey, I want a new, and this is proven based on emails from Clapper or Brennan, I can't remember which one, where basically they're like, look, Obama's calling for a new assessment tomorrow. And then all of a sudden that assessment came out and was like, yeah, Russia was interfering to help Trump. And we went painstakingly through that and looked at the evidence that the assessment used to make the claim that Russia was trying to help Trump. And it was all a joke. It'd be like an email from an unknown source at an unknown time referencing some unknown situation saying, we're pretty sure Putin wants Trump to win. Or it would be stuff that was completely taken out of context, like one sentence somewhere. And it was only like 3 or 4 things, including the Steele dossier, which was put in the appendix that suggested this. And there were whistleblowers from the intelligence community that came out and said they thought this was terrible, that it didn't meet their evidentiary standard. And all of this happened directly after the FBI and other intelligence agencies were reporting to Obama, yeah, we didn't see Russia interfering to help Trump. He demands a new a new report. And just like that, all of a sudden, yep, they were doing it to help Trump. And it was used as a huge bludgeon to go after Trump. So what they're discussing here is, does this look like Obama may have been involved in a conspiracy after he saw that Hillary Clinton lost the election to try to smear the incoming Trump administration? And Jim Trust here, who you can see his credentials were former chief of the organized crime and gang section of the DOJ.
Manufacturing intelligence information with the help of a CIA director, if that's all true, that seems directed towards fueling what became kind of frivolous impeachments from my perspective.
What is the legal theory behind the grand conspiracy, and is it viable in the federal courts?
I think there's a good chance that you're talking about a deprivation of civil rights under 18 U.S. Code 242. Ironically, perhaps, you could argue that there's a conspiracy to defraud the United States, which was a lead charge that Jack Smith used for January 6th.
Let's talk about the floor.
So there you have 2 possible charges. Now that first charge I'll have to look up. The Jack Smith charge would be hilarious. That Obama and company were trying to defraud the United States by sabotaging an incoming administration. That would be hilarious. Let's keep going.
Florida case. This is the investigation involving the former CIA director, John Brennan. Do you believe John Brennan gets indicted?
It certainly feels like it's heading that way. You know, what I think about with Brennan is, and same with some other people we'll talk about, like Mr. Comey, there's an incredible amount of room for moral blame. You know, I do think the transparency for what was happening in terms of the Obama administration and Brennan and Comey, there's a lot of people that deserve a lot of scrutiny for what they did. Whether that hangs together as a criminal prosecution is really an entirely different question, particularly when you're talking about something 9 or 10 years ago. And in conspiracy cases, there is room for that. But it's not going to be just substantively what happened in 2016 or 17 without, you know, serious procedural questions.
So one of the things, now I take this with a grain of salt, right? Because I am not a lawyer or an expert in interpreting these laws, but from my looking into it, a lot of these specific charges that you could bring would have passed the statute of limitations. The charge of conspiracy, though, every act in furtherance of the conspiracy sort of resets the statute of limitations. And so if they're committing acts 2-3 years ago that would fall within the statute of limitations that is continuing to further or cover up that conspiracy, that could reset the clock on the statute of limitations. And so there are significant questions about the statements that you hear people like Brennan and Comey and perhaps even people like Obama making, that could be in furtherance of their conspiracy to deprive people of their rights by sabotaging the Trump administration or violating Trump's civil rights, etc. So that's what they're referencing here.
You've described the Florida investigations and potential prosecutions as the mothership. What do you mean that Florida is the mothership?
Well, my impression is that whatever's coming out of Florida, if there's an indictment, is going to be the broadest indictment in terms of covering timeframes, covering people and officials, and perhaps different charges. It's going to be more about election interference conducted by people at the highest reaches of government. So that would certainly be a much more impactful, much more historic prosecution if that comes out.
Now, I agree with this. I think that the Florida case is likely to be the most impactful for various reasons. One, largely because of the cooperation. Well, let me put it this way. Ron DeSantis has ran Florida very well, so it seems like there's a better chance that there will be any forms of cooperation that's needed, gathering evidence, etc. Will be easier to get out of Florida. Now, I think that's the least important and may end up not being an effect whatsoever, but it's something to consider. In addition to that, a Florida grand jury and a Florida jury is going to be far more sympathetic to hearing about these abuses than, say, a D.C. jury, which is where people like Durham were bringing cases in D.C. D.C. jury is going to defend the deep state in their war against Trump every time. That's not necessarily the case in Florida. So it's, I think, a better chance there. And it seems to me obvious that the case that's being investigated and the subpoenas being offered are very broad ranging in Florida. And it's the case that it's trying to build is that there was this grand conspiracy, that it wasn't just Comey. It wasn't just Comey working with Brennan. It was key officials all across our intelligence agencies and executive agencies and key politicians, perhaps like Swalwell, Adam Schiff, etc., that were all designed in promulgating a conspiracy through illegal acts such as leaking classified information, lying or libeling or slandering, working with the FBI to do illegal investigation techniques such as wiretaps, etc. I think that that's what we're likely to see. And as such, we're likely to see the most serious charges that are the most damaging. I've called the Russiagate investigation, the Steele dossier specifically, I wrote in November of 2017, or I think 2017 I wrote, if it turned out that Hillary Clinton's team's opposition research was used to get FISA warrants against Trump's team, it was the biggest political scandal in the history of the United States. And I stand by that. If they used that to start what was tantamount to the beginnings of a so far 12-year investigation into Donald Trump, and it all started based on these lies that were funneled by Hillary's team to allies in the FBI, that's incredible. So I think that Florida is the case that we'll see. This James Comey case at face value is weaker, in my opinion, but we'll see what comes of that. I'm fine with the indictment, but that allegation is weaker. But the idea that there was strategic leaks from Comey to the press to help Hillary or to harm Trump, or they intentionally shut down investigations into Hillary or Biden in an attempt to harm Trump and help them, or they strategically chose to use techniques that were illegal to go after Trump for political reasons, all of that is massively important. And I think that that's likely what the Florida case is looking at. My guess would be that it's not going to bear fruit as much as someone like me would like. But I would not be surprised if they get a handful of people and we end up with an indictment of someone like John Brennan, which would be huge. And hopefully, though, it could get other people as well, your Peter Strzok's, your James Comey's, and it would be beautiful to see people higher up like Obama and people in his administration face justice for that as well.
If charges are brought, do you anticipate it will include this 18 U.S.C. 242, which is deprivation of rights under color of law?
Yeah, best guess is yes. There could be some sort of honest services fraud angle that they try to pursue as well. But I think that the most likely hook there is that 242.
For a layperson, what is 18 U.S.C. 242?
Well, it takes willful, intentional conduct by someone that's designed to take away constitutionally protected rights of another person. What's interesting here is you could couch that in terms of President Trump's right to kind of run unopposed or not face scurrilous impeachments, or you could view it as the voters as a victim of the conduct. A lot of the 242 cases you see involve law enforcement. These are like abusive force cases by the police where they have an obligation to, act within certain constitutional boundaries, and they go out and they do something that is beyond the pale in terms of, violence or abuse or illegal searches, things of that nature. So you have to identify the constitutional right that's at play. Maybe it's the right to a fair election. And then you have to decide, who's the victim that you're alleging in these circumstances.
So it's interesting. The victim, obviously Trump would be a victim, but also the right of the peoples of this country, their rights violated, do not have a free and open election because government officials are intentionally putting their thumb on the scale in those sort of ways, in illegal ways. So interesting that he brings up both would be possible victims in this.
So let's drill down a little further in the Brennan case. As background, in 2017, there was an intelligence assessment that created this public narrative that President Trump was a puppet of Russia. Brennan allegedly lied to Congress about the fact that this Steele dossier, which was Democrat-funded opposition research, was part of the intelligence report. Based on the...
Now, what the Democrats will say is, but it wasn't part of the report. It was merely listed in the appendix. Yes, that's still part of the report. The information listed in the appendix carries with it the veracity that it is truthful. You don't just put unsubstantiated rumors in the appendix. It was there to lend legitimacy to the charge. And then he claimed to Congress, we didn't include it, which is a lie.
Criminal statutes, would that be sufficient to show an abuse of authority?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this is a little bit new territory, but I do think it probably has that color of law component to let that happen. You've got a situation, and the willfulness is going to be important here. He insisted in putting it in. At least that's the allegation. That's a pretty important moment showing that he knows what he's doing, that he's politicized, and he's acting on those political beliefs.
In my view, probably a critical witness is the former NSA Director, Admiral Rogers. He was one of the intelligence chiefs who really pushed back against the Russia collusion allegations. When he left government, has kind of gone into the background. Very high reputation,
Now, for those that don't know, Rogers, you used to hear about Rogers a lot from the QAnon people. QAnon was crazy in a lot of what they believed, but there were things that they talked about that were true. And one of the things that was true was Rogers was a guy who sort of stayed in the background, but allegedly was like, I don't like what I'm seeing here. He sees all of these intelligence assessments and all these actions going on with people like John Brennan and FISA warrants and the railroading of people like Flynn. And he's like, no, this is no good. This isn't good. And so he's sort of blowing the whistle like this shit's very bad. And he has since just basically faded into the background. So some of the scuttlebutt I'm hearing, it's not worth talking about sources or anything because as far as I'm concerned, it's still unsubstantiated rumors. But that Rogers is someone who was key in cooperating in these sorts of investigations. And that he, to put it in like terms you hear a lot, like sort of knows where the skeletons are. Because he was sort of there witnessing, and as an expert in intelligence, as a former admiral, yeah, there's a Q guy there, Virgil says, yeah. Rogers, the allegation is Rogers is the one who let Trump know that Trump Towers was bugged with the Alpha Bank story. And so Trump moved to Mar-a-Lago as a result of that. So very interesting to see what Rogers will have to say.
Very credible. That's the kind of witness, to me, that could be very, very damaging for Brennan.
Yeah, you'd certainly want somebody with that kind of, those bona fides, somebody who's kind of conducting themselves in a way that tells you they're kind of pro-law enforcement, not pro-politics.
How does the Justice Department get around a statute of limitations when the intelligence report was in 2017?
Well, starting with conspiracy. If you have a conspiracy charge, then you can use overt acts and furtherance of that conspiracy that postdate the main object. In other words, obstructionist moments later can be used to restart the statute of limitations, which is typically going to be like 5 years at the most. And it could be in this case that what they're relying on are false statements. If you've given false statements to Congress, if you've given false statements on the media, that may well be the hook they're running with. But we don't know. I mean, there could be, completely different rabbit holes that they ran down that help survive the statute of limitations beyond that.
And obviously this will be an argument the defense will raise. The statute of limitations has ran out of it. But like I said, in the furtherance of a conspiracy, if you continue to take action such as lying about it, other criminal actions that you could take, that could extend the statute of limitations. The other thing to remember is, remember how they got all the Trump people. misstatements to law enforcement. So just because this is where the investigation begins, I hope that the precedent has been set that they grill these motherfuckers a million ways from Sunday, and any remote false statement to law enforcement, even if it seems benign, charge their fucking ass. Put the full weight of the DOJ behind it. Like, there should be no sympathy given to any of these people. They set the standard. It was their standard in going after Trump and everyone connected to Trump. So it needs to be impressed by. I'm not suggesting breaking the law whatsoever. I'm suggesting the standards that they employed be employed against them with equal veracity. I want midnight raids dragging people out in their underwear when Fox News has been tipped off. That was the standard. So what they did to Roger Stone, that's the standard. Everybody was happy with it. They said it was completely fine. I said this is bad. This should not be the standard. I lost the argument. The argument was lost by me and people like me. I accept this standard now and seek to have it employed against the people that employed this very standard themselves. Yeah, give them the General Flynn treatment. Exactly. Threaten their children with criminal indictments, etc., like they did to Flynn.
Brennan was a paid national security analyst for NBC News. Is it possible that every time Brennan went on television that he was restarting the clock, sort of a furtherance of the conspiracy?
Essentially, yes. Not every time he's talking about anything, but if he's literally talking about the conduct back in 2016, 17, if he's denying kind of tipping the scales against President Trump by getting this intelligence report out, that could work. It's going to be the subject of pretrial litigation. I mean, there's going to be motions to dismiss if you're being somewhat creative with restarting the clock on statute of limitations. But generally speaking, obstructionist behavior, conspiracy, conduct designed to keep that thing secret and successful is the type of thing that helps you avoid the statute of limitations.
Another reason that bringing it in Florida will be something that would have more of a chance of success, because you're probably more likely to see judges that are less biased against Trump. Not necessarily, but probably much more likely to get a fair shake there.
Brennan, like so many of these other former senior national security officials, wrote a book. How much does the book, in his own words, come back to haunt him in a prosecution?
And that's the common thread through so many of these cases that deal with like classified information or politicized behavior. So, boy, the hubris of wanting to get a bestseller tends to trip up people a lot. It may not be something where the book has confessions, right? These are going to be pretty self-serving books, but there could be what they call false exculpatories, like things where he's clearly lying. You can prove that he's lying about something, and then you argue to a judge or jury someday that people lie for a reason, and it's because he knew he did something wrong.
Brennan has said that this is politically motivated and that it is a selective prosecution. Will he have a strong legal argument?
No. Well, it depends on a couple of things. I mean, the starting point is, what does the indictment actually look like? My perspective from living with representing President Trump in 22 and 23 and seeing what was happening with Jack Smith, Alvin Bragg, Letitia James, Fani Willis, as somebody who's been around criminal justice, when you see something that's innovative, to a fault, creative, creating crimes that nobody else has been prosecuted for, that's a red flag. That's alarming. Selectivity and vindictive prosecution are tough things to prove for the defense. Selective prosecution under the case law basically means similarly situated people weren't treated the way you were. In other words, similarly situated people were not prosecuted for this kind of conduct. And starting point is, how do you find a parallel? I mean, where do you find a CIA director who orchestrated reports for intelligence distribution and to spur impeachment and kind of the hobbling of a presidency? I don't think you're going to find a clean selective moment by way of parallels.
We're seeing all of these indictments now. Attorney General Pam Bondi is out. There's a new acting Attorney General, Todd Blanche. Does that suggest that Bondi was holding up the process?
Not to me. Particularly white-collar cases are slow boils. When I was a supervisor in the U.S. Attorney's Office, it was always my white-collar prosecutors that said, Jim, we've got to charge this by Tuesday because the statute of limitations is going to run. And I'm like, it's been 4 years. What's going on? And so I think that these types of cases, there's a lot of dotting of I's and crossing of T's that takes a long time. And so I don't view that as something that would have ever started up overnight. It's the reactive crimes. It's the murder on the streets where you have to move quickly that are more reactive. These are not reactive.
I mean, I don't know. Now, this could certainly be true. It could be that Pam Bondi was there, was pushing for this all along, and it was always going to be, regardless if she left or stayed, right around this time that we started to see subpoenas, grand jury testimony, indictments, etc. That could be. My gut feeling is that Pam Bondi was doing a very terrible job. And even if it wasn't intentionally holding things up, that it was because of the poor job she was doing, grinding the gears to a halt. So now, could be total coincidence that she goes and then within weeks we start to see aggressive movement on these things. Maybe not. Maybe she was rightfully saying, we got to hold on. We still have more I's to dot, T's to cross. And Trump got frustrated and said, you're out. And then forced Todd Blanche's hand to operate quicker than they should have. Maybe, but I don't think that's the case. But if I'm being honest and trying to get both sides of the argument, I'm happy that Pam Bondi's gone. I think her handling of the Epstein files alone were such a boondoggle that she should have been gone then. So,
crimes.
So just connecting the dots here, we have Florida, and now we have North Carolina. The former FBI Director James Comey was recently indicted, 2 counts for allegedly issuing a threat against the President of the United States when he posted the 8647 seashells on Instagram. 86 is kind of to harm somebody, and then 47 is the 47th President of the United States. The first count is for willfully making a threat against the president, and then the second is for the transmission of that threat on Instagram. Does the Comey case withstand First Amendment challenges?
Probably. What happens in threats cases is you have to have a subjective proof that establishes that there's an actual intent to threaten the target. Anything short of that is First Amendment protected. So it's kind of a redundant process to talk about it as a First Amendment case. You're either making a threat or you're not. If you're not, it's First Amendment conduct. But it's going to be difficult for any sort of pretrial motion to win the day on that issue because it's a typical kind of factual determination for a jury.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of this. I think you should absolutely have the right to joke and jest and all sorts of things, even things of that nature that could be considered construing a threat. And what they're saying here is, what it hinges upon is, were you serious about the threat? And so what Jim Trust is saying here is as follows. This is, again, I'm no attorney, just to warn you, but what he's saying is this. If there was no First Amendment protection and you were just seeing if someone violated the law of legitimately threatening you, the way you would decide that is take it to court, have a jury hear it, make a judgment. For a pretrial motion to throw this out under the First Amendment, they would have to prove this wasn't a real legitimate threat. Well, how would you prove this wasn't a real legitimate threat? By taking it to court. So ultimately, if a judge says, look, this is only First Amendment protected speech if it wasn't a legitimate threat, how would the judge decide whether or not it's a legitimate threat? Most likely he'd say, that's what we're here to see. Let's go to court. If it wasn't a threat, jury will say not guilty, and it's First Amendment protected speech. If it was a threat, then it no longer is First Amendment protected speech. He's saying because of that, he thinks that this will survive a pretrial motion to toss the case under the First Amendment.
Is there a Supreme Court precedent that addresses cases like Comey?
Yeah, there is. I mean, about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, the Supreme Court finally weighed in on something called the true threats doctrine. And the issue is just simply, do you use an objective standard? Do you just say, would a victim objectively take this as a threat to themselves? Or subjective, meaning when the person issued this threat by way of seashells or other ways, that they intended it to be received as a threat. That's a narrower, more difficult thing for the prosecution to prove. I know Todd Blanche has made comments about we have other evidence. That's going to be important because you certainly don't have Mr. Comey publicly confessing, yeah, I was trying to threaten him.
There's a section in the indictment called forfeiture notice, and it says that if there's a conviction, that the defendant will lose property. Are they talking about Comey's book sales? The seashells were posted as he was preparing to launch his latest crime novel.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't think it's the seashells themselves being forfeited. So you're probably looking at something where you could tie. I mean, you do have to tie in forfeiture to criminal conduct. So maybe it was promotional to make that kind of threat on Instagram and to kind of celebrate your snarkiness that way. So that's what I would guess is they're making a run at the book. It's not going to be broader than that, but that could certainly be a big bite.
The acting attorney general, Todd Blanche, recently said that there's more to the indictment than just the 8647 seashells. What does that say to you?
Well, it tells me, number one, he knows it's a tough case on its face. When you're talking about subjective intent to threaten.
I agree with this also. It is a tough case on its face. And I'll be straight up honest with you. I would vehemently be against a case like this being brought based on publicly available evidence. Now, there could always be stuff behind the scenes, but I would be against this case on face value of being brought if it wasn't for the precedent that was set by the Democrats. That's the issue. They set the precedent with their lawfare in dozens of ways against Donald Trump and people connected to Donald Trump. And so turnabout's fair play. It's not breaking the law. It's technically legal. You're allowed to do this. I say go for it. But it is going to be a tough case without significantly more evidence.
versus kind of snarky, hateful comments. And there's plenty of room for moral condemnation. Don't take any of this as me supporting the actions of Comey. But I think he's probably talking about communications with third parties. Maybe they've got text threads or emails where Comey kind of betrayed the story a little bit. Well, I actually did know what 86 means, or even just animus towards President Trump around that time frame. I can't stand that guy. How could he fire me? All of that could be helpful evidence to show a subjective intent to threaten.
And the idea that he just stumbled across these seashells on the beach that spelled out 8647.
Yeah, I mean, look, I wish you could fingerprint seashells. I think I know whose would show up. But I think that was really kind of that height of hubris snark, knowing that he's not telling the truth, but thinking it's kind of cute to phrase it that way. If he betrayed that lie to other people, that would be a nice little piece of evidence to put in.
And this is, now, I don't know. I don't know the legal standard for this. Now, I will say, just outside the scope of law, if you lie about that, does that mean that you're also lying about not implying a threat? Not necessarily. But it certainly speaks to him being not truthful. And it is beyond a shadow of a doubt. I mean, if you didn't know, James Comey's official story is he was walking with his wife down the beach and stumbled across on this empty beach seashells that said 8647. And he swears he didn't place them there. So if there is evidence that he's texting buddies or sending emails saying, yeah, of course I placed those there, that proves that he definitively lied about that portion of it, when he then later says, trust me, I wouldn't lie about something so serious, I didn't mean this as a threat, etc. When I posted that, to me, that calls into question his credibility and his truthfulness. Now, is it proof? Maybe not in its own, but I think it certainly does speak to the fact that he's lying about this.
Do you anticipate there will be a superseding indictment in the Comey case? And would that charge likely be a violation of 18 U.S.C. 1001, the false statements statute?
If he made false statements to the Secret Service, they could certainly weave that into a superseding indictment. Adding a 1001, not a bad fallback if there's issues with the free speech, the subjective.
And that's exactly part of what I think's going on. And I was talking about this to Ryan, that this could be a legitimate brought case that will be very difficult to win. But in the context of the investigation, Comey lied to law enforcement. I didn't know what that meant. And then he's emailing friends. Of course I know what 8647. I didn't place those seashells. I stumbled upon them. And then he's emailing to friends. Of course I placed those shells. Now he's lied to law enforcement, which in itself is an independent crime, which I remind you is what they got people like George Papadopoulos with. So although the case may seem weak, so is the cases against all of the Trump-connected people. You know how I know they are weak? Because they didn't get indictments for them. Instead, they used it to interview them and then find discrepancies in the interview and then charge that. So I think that's likely what's going to occur here.
Intent on the lead counts. So it could be. I think 1001 has been so overused by prosecutors in recent years. It's kind of a substitute for actual evidence. I'd almost rather they say, we're going to go all in on these threats. And if we have lies, we'll use that. We can still make that admissible evidence, but not necessarily charge a 1001.
There's another investigation that's running in the Eastern District of Virginia. Bloomberg Law was first to report that prosecutors are looking at possible charges against Comey for the sharing of government records. And the name that's come up again is Daniel Rickman. What should people know about Daniel Rickman?
Now, this is the case that originally was charged, but then Lindsay Halligan was deemed by a judge to not be appointed correctly. And because she was the prosecutor that filed the charge went away. The idea, though, is Comey hires his friend on as a special assistant or some title like that to the FBI. And then he admitted that he's feeding his friend information, some of which was classified, with the intent of going to the media. When Comey is asked specifically if he gave information to anyone at the FBI for the purpose of leaking to the media, he says no. Now, this hinges on two things. One, regardless of whether or not he lied to Congress, does it violate some sort of FDI conduct or criminal statute for Comey to intentionally have someone leaking to the press? Second, did he lie when he said he did not have anyone from the FBI leak to the press? The Comey defenders will say Rickman wasn't an FBI agent. And that's what Comey literally was talking about when he testified under oath to Congress. People like me will say, no, the fact that Rickman was working and getting a paycheck from the FBI means that at the time he was an employee of the FBI, which means he was someone from the FBI, which was specifically being given this information by Comey to then leak to the press. Either way, what's ironic is, regardless of if this charge is ever filed or not, It's clearly terrible behavior, but it doesn't matter because it's excused because, well, Comey, who gives a fuck? He was going after Trump.
Well, that he was a longtime colleague of Comey. They were AUSAs together in Southern District of New York. And Comey brought him in for, I think, just the most reprehensible purpose. He brought this man in to be his liaison to the New York Times, gave him top secret and SCI clearance, the highest levels of clearance, so he had access to classified information. And what Comey did with this guy was have him lobby the newspaper for good treatment of Jim Comey. It wasn't even for the institution, it wasn't even for the FBI, which I still think would be very bad. But he literally had a guy designed to comfortably leak information to the New York Times that would help Jim Comey's reputation. And to me, that's one of the most devastating components of his reign as the director.
So there are these declassified records called Arctic Haze, which is 2017 investigated media leaks that related to then FBI Director James Comey. And there are two events. The first involved the leaking of classified information that related to the Clinton email investigation. The intelligence was not verified, but it suggested that then Attorney General Loretta Lynch was somehow compromised. And this is why Comey said he went around her and announced that no reasonable prosecutor would go after Hillary Clinton for the mishandling of classified information. In Arctic Haze, Daniel Rickman discusses a meeting and a conversation he had with the New York Times. And Rickman says, I don't think I confirmed to the reporter the classified information, but I'm saying this with a discount. What does with a discount mean?
Now, this was the one that was the charge from Comey, the leaking of the information about the Clinton investigation, right? So don't get it confused. It wasn't about the leaking of the information against Trump. Now, that is a separate issue that charges could be brought forth. But the first charge, the Halligan charge that was so far dropped, was about the Clinton investigation. Now, Rickman says, I'm not sure, and I remember reading this from Arctic Haze. He's like, I don't know if I verified classified information, but he uses this phrase, he did it with discount. And now I read what that possibly means back then, but I'm sure Jim Truss is going to tell you here.
Well, he's the only one that knows. I mean, I suppose he's saying there was some caveat, like, I may be shading the truth here. Usually when you come to false statement, perjury prosecutions, convenient memory loss doesn't work. And so if it's obvious that this is just kind of a convenient moment of, gee, you got to discount that, meaning don't prosecute me for lying, that will be a problem for him. But, those are still uphill cases, tough cases when they say things like that.
I mean, this looks like clever lawyer speak. Like, don't go after me for a false statement.
Yeah, it's a cry for help, for sure. He's saying, this is probably a whopper, don't prosecute me, but I'm going to say it. I mean, that's almost the parenthetical of the whole thing.
The second incident involved these Comey memos. When Jim Comey was FBI director, he documented about a half dozen conversations he had with President Trump about the Russia collusion investigation and some pretty salacious allegations that were in this dossier. Many of those memos, according to the Inspector General, they contain classified information. So could that be another area of legal exposure?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, and the starting point again is I like to back off from the law for a second and just talk about kind of the ethics or morality or mentality. You've got a guy going to meet with his boss, the President of the United States, who feverishly takes self-serving notes after the meetings. Like, that's a bad sign in terms of loyalty and hubris and kind of narcissism. And then again, if you're the FBI director, you more than anyone are supposed to know the rules of classification and storage and dissemination. And so taking these notes on your laptop out in the car after you've ticked off President Trump and then storing it in your safe at your own house, it sounds relatively secure, but it's a violation. So, he's got classified information that he's holding in a non-secure scenario, at least as I understand it.
Remember, this was the most devastating case against Trump was allegedly the Mar-a-Lago raid for taking classified information back home. That's exactly what Comey was doing, with the purpose of later disseminating it to the media to make himself look good and Trump look bad. That's a separate possible charge that could be coming, is mishandling the classified information in regarding to the Trump notes.
The Columbia law professor have his own legal exposure.
Yes, he has it for knowingly taking possession of this type of material, passing it on to the media if he did that. I think it's really interesting. If you read the reports, it seems like Rickman is almost saying, I wasn't the one that passed it on to the New York Times. They had it. And kind of the ... is Comey did in advance of Rickman's meeting. Again, I don't have evidence of that, but it kind of reads in a way where it's like, well, who else had a motivation to do that? And that would be his buddy from, back in the old Manhattan U.S. Attorney's Office.
Again, so can Rickman be charged? Yes, for mishandling and giving this classified information, which he's also given access to as working with the FBI. But as your trusts say here, reading the testimony of Rickman, it sounds like he's like, I didn't The New York Times talked to me to try to verify, but they already had this information. Now, who other than James Comey had the information? Rickman. So if Rickman's like, it wasn't me, who's that leave on the hook? Now, as Truss says, he can't prove that right now. That's sort of one of the things an investigation would be looking at.
When you get to the bottom line, people who are supporters of the grand conspiracy say that former President Barack Obama was the architect of the conspiracy. He got the ball rolling. The Director of National Intelligence, President Trump, have alleged that he's guilty of treason. Does anything happen to President Obama?
What I would say as a starting point is it's not, it's kind of philosophically something you can refer to as treason, or politically. It's not actual treason in terms of the statute and the elements of the crime. What is it that makes sense here as a charge? It's complicated by his position as a president, as we know about immunity. But I think that when you get down to core executive functions of a president, which is kind of where this line of qualified immunity, for lack of a better phrase, is for a president in office, conducting a shadow campaign to disable somebody you don't like politically is probably not protected. So would it go up to the Supreme Court if President Obama was indicted and there was a motion to dismiss? Yeah, absolutely. But there's room. I mean, there's room for potential prosecution there if they chase this thing down and have the communications coming down from the president that are motivated not by some sort of interest in protecting the public or dealing with law enforcement issues, but by trying specifically to hobble President Trump.
So what he's saying there is, yes, the immunity decision is something that protects, but it only offers this immunity if you're engaged in official actions of the President of the United States. So, for example, if your goal as president, or if one of your duties as president is to be the commander-in-chief of the military, and you carry out military strikes that are deemed later to somehow be illegal, you have immunity from that because those were in your capacity as the President of the United States. Whereas if you're saying, I want you to dig up dirt on my opponent, I want you, now that the election's over, to smear and say that the Russians are helping Trump, does that fall within qualified immunity? The answer is maybe. One reading of the qualified immunity could say, is the president allowed to call for intelligence community assessments? Sure. Is the president allowed to give his opinion on what he thinks is going on? Sure. So if he strongly gives his opinion, I think that the Russians are trying to help Trump, I want a new intelligence community assessment. Is that within his official capacity as president? Maybe. But let's charge him and find out. How about that? Let it go to the Supreme Court. Let the evidence come out then. Now, at the end of the day, I think it would be amazing if they indicted Obama. With the publicly available evidence we have now, it'd be hard to make that case. However, if there are communications from Obama or people in his team saying, like, look, Obama has a predetermined outcome that he wants, or maybe there's communications between Obama and the Clinton team, like, we're going to do our best to smear Trump as connected to Russia, then perhaps that evidence there to bring an indictment. We'll see. I think it would be amazing, even if there's an almost 0% chance that Obama ever faces any sort of conviction or criminal or civil liability for this. But just an indictment would be enormous. I won't hold my breath. I would put it at 10% that it's likely to occur. But it is a possibility.
All of this is unfolding as we approach the midterm elections, and then there are only 2 years left on the clock. Are all of these defendants or potential defendants trying to run out the clock?
They should. I mean, like if you're a lawyer on a case like that, you're representing one of these guys, you kind of make the conclusion that time is somewhat on your side. And what I'm going to watch carefully is kind of how DOJ conducts itself when it comes to the clock, when there's indictments and when the judge is saying, when are we going to try this case? I remember watching this whole thing with Judge Chutkan and Jack Smith in D.C. Jack Smith stood there and said, we need to hurry up and try this in the next 3 or 4 months for this dubious right to a public trial, or right to a speedy trial for the public. If we see that kind of behavior, I'm going to be a little disappointed. But if they say what I think Jack Smith and company should have said, which is, Judge, you tell us, we're not here for politics. We're here because we're actual prosecutors. We're going to be open file on discovery. We're going to share everything, be transparent, because it's an important matter. I'd like to see that attitude in whatever happens with these political figures. I'd like to see DOJ say, hey, we're not here for politics. We'll do it when we have to do it. And if that stretches a case beyond the midterm or a couple of years, then so be it. That would be good to see. But you're right, there's an expectation after the Trump administration, if it's not a Republican in office, that we're going to see a lot of immediate meddling with any outstanding cases.
Well, this issue, the grand conspiracy, whether you feel it's a legitimate allegation or not, is extremely important to President Trump's base. And it's now been a decade since some of the alleged violations occurred. Is it too late for justice?
Well, hopefully not. I mean, and that doesn't even mean necessarily that there's a whole bunch of indictments. I mean, I stick to kind of two components to this. One is if they can legitimately show ongoing conduct in support of the conspiracy, then so be it. They avoid the statute of limitations, and the base can be happy when they see some big names under legitimate indictment. That day may well come. But at the very least, we shouldn't just wed every bit of moral condemnation to convictions. I think there's incredible criticism that's fair game for Obama, for Brennan, for Lynch, for Comey, for Brennan, for people, all the way down to Peter Strzok, Lisa Page, all these different people that were politicized, that were using important law enforcement or governmental positions to get political results that they felt very self-righteous about. I would hope that over time, history looks back and says there was outrageous misconduct.
Well, two things. One, history may look back, but if there aren't criminal consequences for these people, none of it will matter, because point two, our media that would be responsible to give these facts to the people were involved in the cover-up in the first place. And so there won't be this mass moral condemnation. They illegally got FISA warrants of the president of the United States' team. And there's almost no outrage. People like me are still beating the drum some fucking 10 years later, and that's about it. If 1/1000th of this was done by the Trump administration, there would be riots on the street. The mainstream media would talk about it every single day. But because it was done under the Obama administration, it was done by career intel agents that are favorable to the Democrats, to Hillary and Obama. So what will the moral condemnation be? You think that they're not just going to say, this is it? I can tell you exactly what they're going to say. Well, if it was so bad, why weren't there convictions brought? This is all old news. Who gives a shit? Anyways, moving on. So I just, to me, that would be a failure.
By these people, whether they're indicted or not.
There she was, sort of talking about what's going on with these cases. Ultimately, my opinion on this is I'm interested in this. This is one of the key reasons that I voted. It's the primary issue that I was focused on since late 2017. It was the primary story that I was talking about when I started my channel.